Good morning and welcome to the fifth in a series with Serge Marin, which is Showing Up for Racial Justice, and Marin County Free Library, involving race and poverty in the United States, which is poverty and racial justice. The fifth in the series is covering problems created by poverty. My name is Rashida Scar. And I'll be moderating this event. I am the branch manager for the Marin City Library, and I will introduce the folks joining us on this event today. From Showing Up for Racial Justice Marin, I have Barbara Kaler, Lisa Bennett, Chelsea Subowit, and then our special guest today is Cesar Lagleva, and he will be sharing a little bit about his experience working both with government and with philanthropy. And we'll introduce him a little bit more as we get on with our program. Today, we're going to start with some housekeeping. Our next and final session in the series is really going to be looking at elections and poverty. And we're going to be focusing on the ways in which disenfranchising the votes of poor folks, especially poor folks of color, continues to perpetuate a system of inequality. We do have a book list for this series, and if one of my Serge friends can put that into the chat, that would be fantastic. Feel free to check this out to continue your learning and exploration of these topics, and those are available on the Marin County Free Library website. And I'm going to have Lisa start off a land acknowledgement for us. Lisa?
Thank you, Chelsea. We've often do land acknowledgements before gathering, and it's really occurred to me that sometimes these feel fairly performative. And what I'd like to do is share a video that really addresses that very issue. So hold on while I share my screen. I just share that because I think it's really important that we acknowledge how this wonderful idea has been sort of corporatized and had become somewhat meaningless. And so what I'd like to do is share some information about some local Indigenous efforts that are really worthy of our support. The first is the Sogorea Te' Land Trust. After years of prayers and protests, legal battles, Indigenous women led activism and organizing, education campaigns, countless outreach efforts, and with the help of thousands of supporters, the struggle to protect this Ohlone sacred site has prevailed. The city of Berkeley and the Confederated Villages of Lisjan Nation joined together to right a historic wrong, resulting in the rematriation of the oldest shell mound and village site to its original people, said Corina Gould, tribal chair of the Lisjan Nation. This is not only the largest urban sacred site victory in California's history, it's also among the most culturally significant for the Lisjan people. And visit shellmound.org to learn more about the history of the site. And so that's wonderful. That's an example of something that's happening in the right direction. And here in Marin County, where we are on unceded coastal Miwok land, there are Indigenous groups right here who are fighting to regain unceded land. The Alliance for Felix Cove advocates for the protection and restoration of the only remaining 19th century Tamalco, Coast Miwok Tomales Bay, built home at Point Reyes National Seashore. The Alliance claims to re-indigenize the ancestral homelands of the Felix family, the last Tamalco family to live on the western shores of Tomales Bay at Felix Cove, known as Laird's Landing. To learn more about the Alliance for Felix Cove and support their work, and we'll put all this out later, visit Alliance and the number 4, felixcove.org. And that's my land acknowledgement. Thanks.
I know in other events we've discussed, we've had Teresa from the Alliance for Felix Cove join us. We've also discussed Sogorea Te. It's amazing that they were able to get that land in Emeryville back with the people, and I know they're going to do great things with it. It's a very exciting victory that's happening in real time. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started with showing some of our films. And then I'll reintroduce our speaker for today. So the first film to kind of open up our topic is America's Social Safety Net and Political Fights Around It. So this is from PBS News, and it's really opening up the discussion about the history of the war against poverty and these measures against poverty that have tried to been taken in the past. So Chelsea's going to share her screen with those videos. So I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce our speaker for today, Cesar Lagleva. He is a Filipino-American activist, educator, trainer, organizational leader, and psychotherapist in private practice. Since 1989, he has been conducting lectures, presentations, speaking engagements, and workshops on multicultural issues and subjects at international, national, and regional levels. He has received numerous awards and recognition in the area of civil and human rights for his leadership in the social justice arena. In 2008, he received the prestigious Marin Community Foundation's Beryl Buck Achievement Award for social justice. Additionally, he is the recipient of the Martin Luther King Humanitarian Award from the Marin County Human Rights Commission and the Benjamin Dreyfus Award from the ACLU, among others. He is, as an immigrant from the Philippines, he was raised in a diverse working class canal neighborhood in San Rafael. Cesar overcame many challenges and obstacles associated with racial and socioeconomic discrimination, and he continues to uplift marginalized youth through fostering over 15 young people, two of whom he adopted, while raising two of his own children. Today, he takes pride in being a father and grandfather and enjoys traveling, the outdoors, and being an avid fan of his favorite professional sports teams. Welcome, Cesar. We are happy to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
I would like to just dive right in with some questions for you. And I do want to let our guests know that we have the chat open. If you would like to send put questions in the chat, we will reserve some time at the end of our program to make sure that we get to those questions, and you'll have a chance to offer those questions to Cesar. So thank you for utilizing that function. So Cesar, can you tell us a little bit about your past and current work with communities dealing with poverty? What's your background?
Sure. Thank you for having me here once again. And it's a pleasure and honor to be here with all of you. I appreciate this topic because it is dear and true to my heart in my both professional work and in my lived experience. Having been raised as an immigrant from the Philippines who grew up in the Canal neighborhood at age 10 back in 1978, my humble beginnings. So just a little bit about in terms of how I want to sort of distinguish my economic status growing up. So that I can sort of provide some context to my work in Marin in relationship to issues of anti-poverty programs and so forth. I come from a country where there is abject poverty. Though I was raised in a very privileged background and family, I also have been challenged and have also had the benefit of having relatives from my mainland Philippines, my homeland Philippines, of understanding the difference between relative poverty versus abject poverty. Having said that, in my work in the county, it became very clear to me early on that I, as an immigrant, lived under relative poverty. and it's defined by my mother's type of work, in which she basically worked 10, 12 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week, 365 a year. And I say this in part because it's important that when we're speaking in poverty, that we sort of systematize what that really means, because it's as if Marin County, the general view and perception is this relative poverty. I don't think that I need to pander, nor do I address this group to understand that abject poverty is here in this county, and it always has been. It has just been invisible, but now in light of the shortage in housing, it's become a lot more visible. And it's something that I have known for many years, since as a child. And it's just come to the forefront of our mainstream consciousness, as evidenced by the visibility of the high number of homeless folks who are struggling to make simply their basic survival needs met. My work in the county varied, but it was always rooted in how to figure out ways in my own interest and my own passion, and also based on my community's struggles and challenges around poverty. So I focus a lot heavily my career and my civic duties and responsibilities and activities around employment opportunities, housing, education, health, all under the context of economic upliftment. I want to also say that I am rooted in social justice, because all of what I just mentioned, the background of that and the context and the underpinning of all of these areas is rooted in my social justice principles and my beliefs. So in speaking about this very large, very broad subject of poverty, I want to offer up a way to sort of narrow down Marin County, because I think that those videos in of itself provides me, the privilege to sort of give a clearer perspective of how that information, knowledge, and particularly around the Poor People's Campaign, transcends into Marin County and how that is applicable. Also, as it relates to philanthropy, the nonprofit institutions and industry that we have in Marin County, and how poverty is maintained, managed persistently over decades. So I want to just sort of make these intertwining connections between philanthropy, nonprofits, communities of color, and as well as poor white people in Marin County. It's important to sort of create a tapestry or sort of like interconnecting narrative of what this looks like. In my earlier days and in my more bold and perhaps reckless statements that I've said in my earlier years, I've said a lot of things in comparison to what I have sort of seen or felt about my own county, my own community as an immigrant and as a resident of Marin County since 1978. I would say things like apartheid, segregation. I would say things such as plantation. Though they may be very shocking to a lot of folks who I've come to have conversations, dialogue with, if I really took the time and the moment to really deconstruct what that really means in the context of Marin County, though they may be strong, bold words and extreme words, as some of my colleagues and friends say, those are very extreme words. That hurts my feelings. I don't know that these strong words, though it may create fear and shock or disdain for me and my position, does not necessarily dismiss the reality and the truth of this system. We can call it a lot of different things to sort of perhaps sanitize, blunt the gravity of poverty in Marin County. But at the end of the day, the data, the outcomes, the impacts are quite visible if one took the time to really just be open and be a little bit more aware of their surroundings. When I worked for the county government, for example, I would go into a lot of these meetings, and we got into this whole business, data-driven and solution-focused and programs and so forth. And I was one of those folks who were somewhat perhaps obnoxious, sarcastic in the meetings. The data is only as good as what we are going to do about it. And quite frankly, though I find importance in data, I often sarcastically said, folks, you don't need to look at data, just open your curtains, walk around your neighborhood, and there's your data. Go to Canal, go to Marin City, go to West Marin, pockets in the bottom. There you go, data for you. Well, this is not rocket science. It just requires some level of courage, awareness, and admission and acknowledgement. But I know that is a very daunting task, particularly those friends, colleagues, loved ones, and allies that I have built over time, up and down the apparatus of the social power of our county. But my message remains the same. Poverty exists in Marin County, and if we are going to really have serious conversations in eradicating or reducing poverty, we need to get away from perhaps glossy marketing materials, over-consuming ourselves with data points, patting ourselves on the back around outcomes, but rather looking at impacts, looking at policies, and really redefining and reshaping our view and our commitment and our drive to what it really means to work collaboratively as a county to really impress upon the importance of, one, there is no one solution. There is no panacea here. It's a multi-pronged solution. And two, it's going to require the will, political will, institutional will, and leadership and the courage required to do this work from the top down. Because in this county, work from the bottom up, which now I will sort of provide some context to, is quite frankly non-existent. Yes, there are people who are working in their own way through their nonprofit agencies to eradicate or to at least reduce symptoms and alleviate poverty and so forth through their programs. I get all that. That's wonderful. But I believe also that in the absence of true power from the people, as what Poor People's Campaign profess and what it actually does, and I want to call it a movement, a campaign. In the absence of that, I don't know if the institutions that are in place, the systems that are in place in Marin, will be able to move the needle in any meaningful way towards addressing the root causes, but rather continually just sit and be satisfied with the maintenance of poverty, alleviating poverty. The Poor People's Campaign in terms of the California chapter, existed, or I think began in 2022. I was approached by my dear friend, sister, ally, Nell Myhan, who is the regional director of the Bay Area Poor People's Campaign, in which she approached me about a year and a half ago to ask me to see if there was an interest in Marin to really cultivate an interest, awareness, knowledge, and understanding about the Poor People's Campaign. And unfortunately, because of my limits of time and all of my other private life circumstances, I wasn't able to really devote a whole lot of time to it. However, I remain connected to the California Poor People's Campaign, particularly with the Bay Area regional chapter. And there are several counties, I believe 6 counties in the Bay Area, who are actively involved and engaged with the California People's Campaign. And if there is an interest after this presentation or after this this offering, I invite anyone and everyone to let me know, and I can at least serve as a facilitator, as a navigator to who and how to get involved at this juncture. Because if we are going to make any significant changes in Marin around anti-poverty, we must have people on the grassroots level, residents who are directly impacted by poverty, at the table, in the conversation, with its clear demands. Because in the absence of that, therein lies the lack of accountability. So I'll leave it at that for now and ask questions, entertain questions.
Thank you. Absolutely. I feel like what you're saying really connects really closely to what Michelle Ramos was talking about in the TED Talk about philanthropy and the ways in which we are more concerned about the words being used like white supremacy when you can draw direct historical lines between the colonization of the United States and the current issues with poverty, the racist systems and structures that have run this country since its inception, and the outcomes of poverty that we're seeing. So I really feel like you're connecting on those levels deeply with that. And Cesar, we would be happy to make your contact information available if people are interested in getting to know more. We'll go ahead and put that in the chat at the end of the program so that we have that to share. Can you tell us a little bit, you mentioned outcomes and versus impacts. Can you go into depth a little bit about that and share a little bit more? How do you see those two different, I guess, approaches to poverty and how they play out in real time in people's lives?
Sure. And again, I'm going to draw upon my years of work in career profession, working for county government in Marin, Health and Human Services, to be precise. I make a distinction between outcomes and impact in that outcomes are for the purpose of achieving a particular goal on any given year or years. It's very important for me to operate from a place of not only outcome, but impact, because the impact is what is evidently clear over a course of time to really make significant, transformative, sustainable changes. So for example, when I hear outcomes, which is a very normal, typical bureaucratic talk or term, I speak, or I operate from a place of looking at it as, how did we manage poverty, for example, this year? How did we alleviate poverty this year? And it's usually by the numbers served. That's an outcome. And if we served more people, let's say, in the county by giving them more EBT cards and more food and all of that, then we would have done our jobs. That is the systemic view of outcomes. But impact is different. Impact is what have we done to eradicate, reduce poverty, not to alleviate poverty, but reduce poverty in a way that is sustainable, the way that is actually meaningful and transformative and sustainable, again, sustainable in my words earlier. So I draw those distinctions because that is often the elephant in the room that the bureaucrats and my colleagues and bosses didn't want to hear from me. I was the loudmouth in the room. But it wasn't meant to attack, but to ask different questions, reframing different questions, because the outcomes from my vantage point as a senior management manager in Health and Human Services at the time, it was business as usual. And the work of just produce your reports, submit your outcomes, and these outcomes better have the numbers of people served and so forth. It stops there. And I don't know that it was all that meaningful to me as evidenced by the data. And I capitalized on this whole marketing campaign that it had at the time around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to do transformative change, and we're going to go out in the community and say a lot of wonderful things to residents and so forth. And that's when it became very clear to me that the marketing tools, campaigns, strategies employed did not meet or could not meet the antiquated views, practices, systems of the county to do any meaningful, significant work and change towards any transformation, sustainable, anti-poverty solution processes. It's still, and I'm gonna call it out, it's still built that way, and it's not gonna be in my lifetime that is going to change this, but it is gonna require at least a needle to move 1 degree at a time, perhaps per generation. But one thing is clear. Let's not, I would propose it this way. I hope that people can see to it that doing something meaningful in spirit of their kindness and the spirit of giving is a good thing. But I want to also warn folks that if it's for the purpose of charitable alleviation of poverty, do so, because there is a place for that. But if we're going to look at it from an institutional and systemic level, I don't know that anti-poverty, as I know it in the form of positive impacts, are consistent to what we have now in terms of systems that can deliver on that kind of a promise.
Just listening to you speak, it sounds like the part of the problem is that we're looking at not only the wrong data points, but the data points we're looking at is almost like a perpetual motion machine. So, for example, if you're measuring how many meals somebody gets, then your focus is on delivering more meals.
Correct.
Where maybe the data points we should be looking at is how many people no longer need free meals. How many people were able to rise above that poverty level where they need to have that assistant, and how many people slip back down into poverty. So looking at those numbers would tell you, oh, we're alleviating poverty. Our poverty levels are going down. The other one is just measuring meals.
Correct.
And so this many people were served, we gave out this much food, but it's almost maintaining because it's not actually lifting people out of poverty. It's just kind of treating the symptoms instead of the actual disease.
Correct.
Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree. And you
Okay.
hit it spot on. And in that, if we're going to talk about impact again,
Mhm.
I think of like a very, basic example of what an impact looks like. Affordable housing that somebody can own. How's that?
Right.
Will that be a concrete enough vision where someone who's living, let's say, at sub-livable wage in Marin County, can they still be able to afford housing, affordable housing? And let's talk about who this affordable housing is really for, because there's a racial component to that as well. And there's also a class component to that. When people say affordable housing, that implies professionals like myself at the time, because I want to just sort of point some very, basic data points in that one is still considered low income for a household of only one who makes $109,000 a year. Okay, that's considered low income. Okay. I don't know that a, 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 a person who's in construction or doing labor work in restaurants, the service industry, who's making, let's say, even the livable wage ordinance in Marin County, which is $18 an hour. Okay, I don't know that these housing elements are necessarily primarily for them, right? So I want to just sort of further aggregate or disaggregate the what we mean by, low income households by
Yes.
race, by concrete numbers. I also just want to just point, just sort of further illustrate the tapestry of Marin County. Marin County has over 1,700 nonprofits. 1,700 nonprofits in the county. That is more than double than the state average. And there is one nonprofit for every 136 people in the county. And Marin leads the state with the most nonprofits per capita in the state of California. So when I say that there is a plantation, an invisible one, I wonder what that really looks like, or if I want to sort of what the impact and what the implications are. When we have over 1,700 nonprofits trying to do the work of what? Anti-poverty and a lot of other measures to uplift people's opportunities and pathways and so forth. And there's still extreme poverty. I don't think I need to show any more numbers to sort of create the picture. I was like, and imagine the amount of the millions and perhaps billions of dollars poured into this system, a nonprofit industry by, let's say, the Marin Community Foundation. I'm not just picking on them, they are the biggest, richest, one of the richest foundations, in the country. And they just happen to be here exclusively for Marin County. Now, I want to just ask the basic question. With this concentrated wealth in the county, relative and proportional to the poverty that we have in this county, one would imagine, or at least assume, that we would have gotten our act together already. It defies logic. I have my own assumptions, but I don't want to get too editorialized for myself.
I think that is really telling. That's actually a new data point for me, hearing that there are that many nonprofits. And I mean, if each of those nonprofits actually sponsored that 130 some people, why should poverty exist under those conditions? And where is that destruction of the status quo of the maintenance of poverty? Because that's what it sounds like you're talking about. In a lot of ways, poverty is maintained.
Yeah. Mm.
And why is that? Why are we
So
yeah, talk to me about that. That's interesting.
there's also, I'm going to sort of illustrate a dynamic here. For a lot of leaders, and particularly leaders of color in Marin County, who live and work in the county in which they, sort of do their business, raise their kids, go to church, place of worship and all of that. There's a political structure just in place that's invisible, in which many leaders of color find themselves, due to limited opportunities in the county and beyond, perhaps, to find themselves holding down the fort of their nonprofit agencies. The dynamic typically is that if I become a director of my agency, I am not only beholden to making sure that the fiscal health of my agency and organization maintains and remains intact. And if I challenge the status quo, in which I am struggling to meet the fiduciary responsibilities for my organization, while on a very personal and deep level, I see my people, my community members continuing to struggle in the face of those who have hold the purse strings to my funding. That is going to dilute what I say a lot. And that is part of the tapestry of the plantation system. Because
that makes sense.
Putting us, and I'm going to put myself in this equation because I work for the system. Putting myself to feed my children, put food on the table, while holding on to a relatively prestigious position for the county at the time. There's a payback, and it's called silence, pacification.
Maintenance of the status quo.
That's the price of admission to survive in Marin County. And I'm not only speaking alone. This is, my brothers and sisters of color who are in leadership positions in nonprofits. We talk about this all the time. So let's just be clear about that. In privacy, honestly, because the fear of retaliation, loss of funding, loss of relationships, loss of status is real.
I think that we can see that too, and where Michelle Ramos was also talking about that, how communities have covered those grassroots efforts that make have the most impact on decreasing poverty, actually decreasing it, and not just kind of pacifying or playing to poverty, have to walk such a fine line where they have to turn down possible opportunities for exposure. They have to turn down avenues of funding so that they can continue to do the work. Any organization that is connected with kind of the larger structure, the system, they have to walk such a fine line just to ensure that their organization is able to do the small amount of good that, if it's an organization that feeds the hungry, they have to be real careful about speaking out about the fact that I can feed the hungry, but if they're not getting systemic help, holistic help for their whole lives, I can't, I'm just, putting a Band-Aid on the problem. They can't speak out about that because they're concerned about their funding and about the reputation of their organization, as you say.
Right.
I think that is a problem.
Yeah, and can you imagine and one can imagine, hopefully, the conundrum that they find themselves in, and that includes me, between my own personal conscience and sense of responsibility for my and to my community. And also upholding my professional role and obligations to my employer, in this case, the county government, in which I live a double-edged sword of a life. So that becomes that toxic over time, right? And thus the whole notion and concept of the plantation system.
Where you're just managing your own little patch of assistance, but it's never really making the deeper impacts for the problems that are affecting people. And I think too, a lot of especially philanthropy organizations or even government departments, because their wheelhouse is food, is education, and they're all siloed and separated, they're never addressing the fact that the problem is systemic and holistic.
Right.
Poverty is
Right.
systemic and holistic. Education is a part of that. Food is a part of that. Housing is a part of that. But by addressing these poverty piecemeal, you're never quite getting to the root of the problem, which is people need more money. They need a place to live. They need reliable jobs that pay enough that they can afford all of those things.
And when I look at institutions in Marin County, like I said, if I sort of, when my dear friend and brother, late Kerry Pearson, he and I would philosophize and sort of think tank and struggle in our own visions and our own solutions. You know, I mean, we easily can make the connection, the interlocking, and as Reverend Barber would say, the interlocking connections between, let's say, in Marin County, employment, housing, education, and health. But in Reverend Barber's interlocking vision, racism, ecology, war economy, militarism, religion. So I just wanted to offer that up as these are structural issues that is not pinned solely on one institution or body of systems. It is there, and it is very intricately intertwined.
And this isn't a problem just in Marin County. This is a national, global problem. So, you know, we're honing in on Marin County, but the pattern that the People's Campaign is seeking to disrupt and to fight against is the same pattern that we're seeing on the local level here.
Right.
I would love to hear more about your thoughts on government, and especially the local government here in Marin. And what are some of the ways that you've kind of seen that impact versus outcomes play out on a government level? I think you've really clearly laid it out in from a philanthropical standpoint, but how does that work in a government context?
Sure. So when a great question, and I want to sort of put it in the context of policies, that the role of government serves many different functions, but let's just look at it and isolate it from the position of policy. When I see government leaders or elected officials dealing with issues such as our proverbial housing crisis and how that interconnects with the visible and increasing homelessness that we are witnessing and experiencing in our time. I sometimes question whether the policies that are being drafted, that are being instituted, is for the purpose of working downstream in a way that sort of uplifts people who are literally on the streets first, right? Versus pandering to or trying to address the needs of those who are yes, they're very entitled and they should be considered, who are already just barely making it, but yet at the end of the day can also advance that boost. So in other words, if we're going to work upstream, I want to ask the greater question, because I offer at this point very little solutions, but I could, but there's plenty of solutions there, and people can just go Google them, and there's a lot of different opportunities to get involved. But I don't want to necessarily fall in love with just a solution, but rather frame it in the form of questions. Like, so the government's role, going back again, and this is what Reverend Barbin has said, what is the government's role? And he basically says there's an attention violence in which we sort of somehow in this county pay lesser attention to folks with the most acute needs.
Yes.
And so therein lies part of the issue. And it is on one level understandable, but understandable does not necessarily mean agreeable. All right. I understand their political lives, careers are on the line oftentimes from their constituents. So the policymakers are also equally challenged to really create a fine balance between their political survival and balancing out the agenda in a way that distributes the resources as equitably as possible. So it is. So I just don't want to necessarily just pin, the whole responsibility onto the government or the foundation, but they are the two biggest entities, and there's a running joke back in the day when my dear friend Kerry was alive. I was like, who's the real government in Marin County? It ain't county government, it's Marin Community Foundation. One is just more accountable than the other.
I think that you're hitting on some points, and I think we touched on this in our previous series when we were looking specifically at housing, about the ways that the folks who are most in need of these resources don't have a voice, right? Because the voice comes from voting, having access to voting, having access to the almost unionizing, gathering grassroots force of numbers. Poverty is isolating. So, when you suffer, you're suffering alone a lot of times, even when you're in a group of people. You look at a homeless camp, everybody's just trying to survive on their own. The force of being able to join and be a voice that is able to speak to government, that is able to speak to philanthropic organizations and say, hey, this is what we actually need, is not present for folks who are that far below the poverty line. Oftentimes, the folks with the voice starts at the middle class. So you have those folks petitioning government because they have a voice. They have access to voting rights. They're not dealing with the level of mental health and physical health, disability issues that folks who are that far below the poverty line are dealing with. And so they're able to when they get affordable housing, it's affordable for them, as you were saying so clearly. It's affordable for the middle class that might be on the edge, about to drop down, but there's no uplifting from the very bottom up, which would improve outcomes for that middle class as well. So it's not as far of a reach for government officials. They don't have to reach far to help somebody who's already in a home, maybe help them stay in a home, maybe provide, more housing for those folks who are kind of already in apartments, already in homes. It's a lot more work to take somebody who has a lot of issues that are on the streets and help them get housing. So there's the problem never gets solved because we're not we don't have the will to reach down as far as we need to
Mhm.
and assist at that basic level those who are struggling the most. So
Correct. And
then we're
it's
just very superficial.
correct because it's, it's a quintessential definition of poverty prevention. How do we prevent poverty? And the county, I must, give it, give it its kudos. It does a fair amount of good work, and the foundation to preventing or trying to prevent poverty. But to suggest that they're doing any level of meaningful work in the way of policies, philanthropic giving, in not in reducing poverty. I challenge that at any given point in time. It's poverty prevention, perhaps, but it's not poverty reducing.
Reduction. I can definitely see that. I would like to open this up if folks in the who are joining us today on the Zoom would like to offer up questions. I'm going to continue asking questions, but if other people have questions that they would like Cesar to answer, that feel free to pop those into the chat and we will we'll address those. Can you tell us a little bit more about your involvement with the Poor People's Campaign? How has their work been effective? What have you seen? How are they kind of addressing some of those gaps that you're seeing with a lot of other philanthropic organizations and government organizations? What are they doing right?
Right. So from my vantage point, a lot of the work that the People's Campaign in California particularly is in a form of legislation and policy advocacy. In Sacramento on a statewide level. Right. There are county coalitions who are working to promote livable wage jobs, promotion and advocacy for unionization, affordable and adequate health care. I think of them as doing a lot of work in the area of environmental justice, right? Because there is that connection. So I want to sort of look at the movement, the California People's Campaign, as a movement based on coalitions from different sectors of our society: labor, the homeless, the disabled, the LGBTQ, BIPOC, or whites. It is multiracial. And it is, it's multiracial and it is diverse and under the umbrella of poverty, because the videos clearly illustrates poverty doesn't discriminate, right? In that
It's
sense,
intersectional.
That's right. So though we can center race as a piece and a feature of that, we can also easily center gender, right, as a piece of that, the disabled community. All of this to say that the work of the California People's Campaign, my dear friend, is creating and educating the communities, particularly the affected, to build power from the bottom up. It is literally in the spirit and the intention and the act of grassroots mobilization and organizing. So that if there is anything that I can pin my hat on that is visibly clear, it is the people, for the people, and by the people. And that is the power. That is the power that it generates in the form of a lot of demands, policy demands onto the system. And it holds no, political affiliation between left or right, as Reverend Barbara would say. And I imagine and I dream of a time that Marin County can possibly have such a movement in which it's not limited in the area of, are you a left-leaning or a right-leaning? we're guilty on all sides of the spectrum politically. This is not a political issue. This is a social and moral issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you're hitting the nail on the head with the ways that our bipartisan system and the pitting of the left and the right, he was so good about pointing out neither of them are addressing the real needs of the poorest Americans. That, again, the attention is directed towards the middle class, and the folks they can count on to come out and vote every year after year after year. But the Poor People's Campaign is taking that the fact that a lot of the poor are so voiceless and isolated, and connecting them together, and then giving them that voice in that highest areas of government, and locally as well. Do they have a seat at the table of these meetings where nonprofits are gathering? Do the poorest in our county have a seat at the table in the middle of those county government discussions?
Yeah. And right now, the only gatherings I see are Benford Place in Nevada. That's where they're gathered.
Yes.
And they're very militarized, making sure they got that
Yes.
invisible and can't, they got they stay in their lane and stay in their reservation.
Yeah.
So that's what it looks like visibly to me. And Lisa had a great question about, what is the role of adequately resourced white folks in reducing poverty in Marin, both on a personal and societal level? Great question, Lisa, and I appreciate that. I will offer up a way for white, economically, financially, relatively privileged folks. And I'm going to include myself in this. Okay. Because I want to just make sure that I'm also operating purely, for now, centering class. Because I consider myself, though once upon a time, working poor, now achieve some level of relative success. Now I characterize and qualify myself as middle. I want to offer up a way for us to sort of consciously think about how we, one, think about poverty and what our role is as it relates to our brothers and sisters who have less than. I think on a most basic and fundamental level, think about our own families, our friends, our loved ones. Think about what it means for us to climb up socially and economically, right? I think of white folks. The majority of white folks in this country didn't just immigrate here or didn't just come to America already rich. No, they stood on the backs of Black and brown indigenous folks.
Yeah.
It's climbing up. It's climbing up the ladder, if you will, the income and social ladder. And if we can sort of take a stop for a moment, it doesn't have to be outside and reach out to your neighbors and all of it. Just think of yourselves. What level of privilege were you raised in? Middle class, lower middle? And if for those who are really upper with a lot of privileges, great. But think of your loved ones, friends, who didn't have the opportunities afforded to you. And what does that mean for you? Because a lot of people would say, man, you guys are asking, demands are increasing on us, and people don't need any more demands being placed on them, right? And then I caution myself, for that matter, to not offer up any possible ways for people to do things in a way that is unrealistic or seemingly demanding, or that may create resentments, further resentments. Because it's a tall ask.
Yeah, that is because I think because of our privilege, and I'm throwing myself in there too. I'm pretty solidly middle class. we've come to expect the continuing focus on us, the continuing solidification of resources upon us and the folks that are in that situation. And so, as we see with white privilege, the even the idea of giving some of that privilege, some of that power to somebody else feels like oppression. And I think we get into that mindset as middle class folks too. It feels like, oh, why are you helping those folks when we need help? But the answer is, when we help those folks, everyone gets helped, right? So I am more secure when they are more secure. And so when we're working together, it's important that we include ourselves and connect ourselves with our poor brothers and sisters. I think that's really important. And I think another important aspect that the Poor People's Campaign brings. It's bringing folks who have marginal power to the folks who have, along with the folks who have no power, along with folks who have lots of power. How do we connect them and make sure that everybody is taken care of?
It's framing the narrative. It's really guiding folks in the level of awareness based on information, data, results, evidences. Reverend Barber, made a statement that might have gotten overlooked in his message around the work first model, right? That if we're going to incentivize poor folks to get their services and their goods and their survival needs, we should require them to work. And that's part of the issue here, is that I think until we begin to see that majority of poor folks are not, one, lazy, two, are willing and wanting to work, because work is a birthright. It is a purpose. It's a human condition to have labor, to find meaning, because work provides meaning to the soul, to the spirit of the human condition. But to assume, and I banter around with my relatives around this all the time. Well, those folks, they're hungry, they broke, let's just get a job. Not precisely my family too, right? Because I made it up, I worked hard and I'm an immigrant and I did this. I didn't, I kept my mouth shut. Yep. Yes, they did. And I get all that. But to really examine the implied underlying message about we will require poor folks to work.
Right.
Because the subtext to that is, because if you give them money or services and opportunities, they're just going to take full advantage of all of it, which is a complete fallacy, because of the fact that this system was never designed to provide opportunities for them to get work.
That's right. I think there's so much to be said about the oppression of opportunities and the ways that opportunities are withheld purposefully. Like when we talked about this, I think in our previous event, where we were talking about, if you get a job, they take away the safety net. So you're actually less secure when you have work and more in danger of falling further down the poverty trap when you play by the rules that are laid out for you as somebody who's dealing with poverty.
Correct. Here's another question. In other sessions, we've talked about the way poverty impacts the mental health of the impoverished. Can you touch on your experience with behavioral health to share what sort of impacts should be considered in addressing poverty, which acknowledge the impacts of mental health? Great question. There's a thing called, in my work, in my profession, trauma. Okay. Trauma, and in most cases, trauma associated with poverty is what we would consider clinically as secondary trauma. But the cumulative effects of poverty traumatizes people not only individually, but community-wide and generationally. So there's a generation of traumatized communities, often in poor communities, in which they recycle the symptoms, the behaviors, the attitudes that mimics one of despair, hopelessness, anger, resentments. So I want to just sort of offer that up in the most general way that yes, trauma based on poverty, discrimination, and degradation of one's basic dignity is a direct result of poverty. And the impacts of that is quite evident by the number of high disproportionate number of alcoholism, drug addiction, mental health disorders and disabilities, violence, incarceration. Those are all symptomatic effects of a much larger root cause of the issue, poverty. So when we isolate and say this person acted criminally or behaved or acted, yes, they did. No dismissing that whatsoever. But but let's further that narrative. Why did this person create or act criminally? Why did this person rob that store? Why did that person, shoot that other person? That's it. So it's we just generationally recycle our trauma and the criminalization of the mentally ill. Well, shoot, I don't think it requires, like I said, top secret either, to understand that our prisons are the de facto mental health institutions.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's deeply connected too with kind of the cycle of legislation. So legislation often is directed towards these behaviors that are born out of poverty. So,
Right.
that welfare queen myth, those people are all on drugs and they're just going to spend that money we give them on alcohol or whatever. That becomes the narrative that is playing out when these laws are being made, and the laws are trying to mitigate that instead of mitigate the conditions that created that. So
that's right.
Those behaviors that you're trying to legislate against, they're actually the ones that are they're coming from poverty, which your legislation is failing to address. So
it's a loop
cycle.
It's a loop. So it goes back again. I mean, I wonder, and I think you're old enough to remember this, Rashida, and that you keep in mind the 80s and 90s, the number one economy of the state of California was prison building.
Yep.
So I just want to offer that up as another anecdotal and real example or evidence to know that we have learned to criminalize the poor.
Very much so.
Criminalize them, and to Reverend Barber's point, the militarization. Look at our police practices that have evolved. Look at our police practices that is, military style strategies and tactics employed onto our residents. And that's where the economy is now, militarization.
Absolutely. And when you look at it, all of that was happening. I remember Reagan closing down all those mental health institutions. That was happening at the same time that they're building the prisons. So it feels very like step A, close the mental health facilities. Step B, open up prisons to handle all of those folks who are now, dealing with their trauma out in public instead of, with mental health professionals. Well, we'll just shuttle them into the prisons. I could go on. I literally.
And you have the disproportionate number, and that's one thing that they all have. All of them have in common in terms of the majority of the prisoners and inmates, poor, and disproportionately Black and brown
people of color. Absolutely, 100%. I have a question here that was sent. I think Marin County has a lot of environmental nonprofits that are not working directly with poverty. Or maybe they have socio-environmental programs. What is the connection between your environment and social issues? I know they are very connected, but how do you see the environment nonprofits' role in poverty eradication? That's from Chris.
Sure, I appreciate that question. So the connection between environment and poverty is such that in the most broad sense, and I can get into very specific, but I don't have in the limits of time. It won't require me to have this fair discussion of an analysis discussion, but I'll just put it this way. When communities of color or let's just say impoverished communities are impacted by its environment or vice versa, one would have to look at, let's take a look at first, who's in control, who's making decisions, who's making decisions in the area of the environmental movement and environmental institutions and organizations. Two, who benefits from those decisions? And then three, what are the negative consequences or impacts, or who pays as a result of those decisions? I want to be very mindful. I want to be very clear. Let's just take Richmond, for example, the refinery.
Great example. Okay.
The whole city of Richmond is by and large an environmentally hazardous place because of the refineries. And what is the concentration of people living with or among and around those refineries? Predominantly brown and black folks. Now let's also talk about Marin, but let's bring it to West Marin.
Sure.
Bucolic, beautiful West Marin. If anyone here can penetrate the living conditions of ranch and farm workers who are predominantly brown, immigrant Latinos, Latinx, I think that one can begin to visibly see the interconnection between racism, environmental injustice, and classism. That's just I'm not making any bones about that because quite frankly, I have loved ones who live there under those abject conditions. And they are invisible. And so I want to just offer that up without getting into a whole slew of analysis, but really pointing your attention to areas in which you can sort of further wrap your mind around what is the correlation between environment, poverty, and racism, in this case, in West Marin. And then once that person sort of identifies and acknowledges it, the story will reveal itself in a form of just simple observations.
We have touched on that in past events as well, and just the ways in which the perception, and again, I think this keeps coming back to narrative. You know, the perception is that beautiful, you know, rolling pasture lands. Well, first of all, the pasture lands aren't normal. That's not the way California originally was. California were wild grasslands, very diverse. They became mono, you know, environmental pasture lands because of the cattle that we brought onto the land that overgrazed, the runoff from, you know, their waste poisons the streams, poisons the water. And then you have folks literally living in conditions where they're on that poisoned land. They're playing in their children. I mean, we were talking about how, you know, you have these, you know, watering holes, you know, that kids play in. The children of the farm workers are playing in, and they're filled with runoff of the waste from the cattle. The housing situation, we discussed this, and if you look at some of our past book lists, we actually have, you know, audio recordings of ranch hands discussing what the conditions are like. If you want to educate yourself on that situation, there is a deep connection between the environment and poverty. The canal, the fact that Marin City floods and has a flooding issue, that is not on accident. None of these things are on accident. The poor are in those positions where they have to they have to live in conditions of environmental poverty.
And I want to clarify also, just specifically when I asked the rhetorical question, like who decides?
Mhm.
I'm speaking about that racially speaking. Okay. In part because it's very important to understand, that when those who make decisions, including the landowners in West Marin, who are they racially? And who are their workers racially? In the backdrop of an environment that is ecologically fragile. And where are the opportunities, resources, services, basic goods and services located?
Right.
Just asking.
Where do their workers have to get their food, their housing, their resources? Yeah, I think that is all deeply, deeply connected. And government has a very real opportunity to speak into that, to have those folks who are on those ranches and the folks who are in the canal and the folks who are in Marin City be there when the decisions are being made. And I think often that does not happen because it's easier to just talk to the people that are already at the table, right?
Correct. No, that's correct. No.
I would love to dive in more, but we are at time. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I want to thank you, Cesar, for joining us today. I want to say a special thank you to the Friends of the Marin City Library who helped sponsor this program and ensure that this partnership continues. Cesar, I will those who have registered for this event will get a link to this recording. And Cesar, I would be happy to include with that email your information for folks who want to get further involved, or you can reach out directly to me and I will make sure I'll pass on his information if they're interested in learning more about the Poor People's Campaign here in Marin County and in California and ways that they can get involved. I really want to connect people to that. I'm going to put some information in the chat for our book list. If you want to know more about Surge Marin or the National Poor People's Campaign, I've got a link in there, as well as the Alliance for Felix Cove, if you wish to support their efforts. Thank you again, Cesar, for joining us.
Such a pleasure.
Always a wonderful joy to do these events and to learn so much more about the ways that these issues impact all of the residents of Marin County, especially Black and Brown residents, especially those struggling with poverty. We want to make sure that people are educated and ready when these voting opportunities come up. Who you vote for matters. The propositions you vote for matters. And we're going to be talking about all of that at our next event. So this is a direct connection between what we're talking about here. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Such a pleasure.
Everyone, please have a wonderful afternoon and take care.
Mahalo.